This is Gemara Baba Basra, Daf Kof Chof Aleph. The Daf for Shmini Atzeres has been sponsored as incredible schos, Rafua Shlema for Tinoik ben Miriam Ahuva B'siyata Dishmaya. The Koyach HaTorah, Talmud Torah B'Rabim on Shmini Atzeres should bring Tinok ben Miriam Ahuva an incredible and complete Rafua Shlema B'Karev. We're holding 4 lines in the bottom as we're back and forth. Beishami Beis Hillel, the Gzir Shava, Zeh. Says the Gemara, the Beishami, let's look Gzir Shava. Beishami does not hold of this Gzir Shava. So first, so how does Beishami know a very basic halacha? Halacha that how are you made for a neder? How you know of how? Of course, you need 3 people. How does Beishami know that in if they don't have the Gzir Shava of Zeh? Says the Gemara, Nafkalu miditanya. Beishami learned from the following brayso. That's the Daber Moshe as me'adei Hashem al bnei Yisrael. Rav Yosef Glili Omer. Teach Rav Yosef Glili as we turn over to today's Daf Kof Chof Aleph Amid Aleph. Teaches Rav Yosef Glili Mo'adei Hashem Nemru b'Shabbos. It says Mo'adim, the Yom Tovim of Hashem by Shabbos. Shabbos Reishis. Excuse me. Ma'adei Hashem Nemru. It says Ma'adei Hashem. Shabbos Bereishis Lo Nemru. Shabbos Bereishis is not mentioned. Ben Azai Omer says Ben Azai. Ma'adei Hashem Nemru. Afars the Darim Lo Nemru. So says the Gemara. So that is where Beishami is going to learn that first the Darim. Bish Laisha Dioitis. If you don't see Banasan Gomer La La Mesnita. Ravisi Barnasan Gomer La La Mesnita learned this brayso. And he did not know how to explain it. Azal Basri Rav Shishas and Ardai. He went past following Rav Shishas and Ardai to understand the brayso. He didn't find Rav Shishas. Azal Basri the Mechuza. He followed Rav Shishas to Mechuza Ashkechei. And there in the Mechuza, he was able to find Rav Shishas Amar Lei. So Rav Yisrael Nasan asked of Rav Shishas, "My Mayadei Hashem Nemru Shabbos Bereishis Lo Nemru." What exactly does this mean that Mayadei Hashem is mentioned, but not Shabbos Bereishis? Replies Rav Shishas Amar Lei, Mayadei Hashem Srichin Kiddush Bezdin Srichin Kiddush Bezdin. Mayadim of Hashem require Bezdin to be Makadesh to sanctify them, whereas Shabbos Bereshis Eino Tzricha Kiddush. Shabbos, of course, happens on its own. It does not require any input by Bezdin or anyone else. Whereas when it comes to the Mayadim, they indeed require a Bezdin to create the Kedusha in order so that there is the Yom Tov. And of course, the Siyata Dishmaya on a Shmini Atzeres, which is a yontiv unto itself, that of course always the Siyata Deshmaya discussing how the Mayadim who are beginning, this is a yontiv daf, this is the Shabbos Bereishis, what Shemini Atzeres, right for Simchas Torah, is when we finish the Torah and we go into Shabbos Bereishis. Absolutely incredible. Be'ein Tzrichin Kiddush, Bezdin doesn't need Bezdin to be Mekadosh. Says the Gemara, Salkadaita Chamina, you really thought, Hayal Uksivi Gabi Mayadois, what are you teaching me? There was a Hava Amina that because Shabbos is written next to the Mayadois, there's a Hava Amina that it would actually require Kiddush like the Mayadois. Kamash Malan, and therefore, excuse me, I read it wrong. Sal Kedaitach, you would have thought that it requires Kiddush. Kamash Malan, that it doesn't. My Mayadei Hashem. So says the Gemara. Now we continue the brayso. Ma Mayadei Hashem Nemru Hafaras Tadarim. Ma Mayadei Hashem Nemru Hafaras Tadarim Lo Nemru. What does that mean in the brayso? Mayadei Hashem Srichin Mumchen, whereas Hafaras Tadarim Einai Srichin Mumchen. And this was the makar they were looking for. That Hafaras Tadarim needs Shleisha Hedyotes. Asks the Gemara 1 second. How can he say that? But by Hafaras Tadarim, what does it say? Rashi Amatais. Seemingly it has to be the heads of the Rashim. It has to be the Mumchem. It's not enough to have a regular head yet. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Rav Yechanan. b'yachin mumcha. From Rashi Amatis, we learn that you could do a yachin mumcha or shleisha edyotis. That really wraps up the conversation from yesterday, which was the conversation Beisham Beisilel, the Gzer Shava zeh. Says the Gemara. Now we go back. Go back to the discussion that we had, which centered around keeping a nachla within one shevet, and we learned that one is not supposed to and not allowed to, and it's also marry outside of their shevet. A daughter who's going to yarshin something cannot marry out. So Tanan Hasam are about 14 lines down. First word in line is mumcha. Tanan Hasam Amar Ashbag lo yom time li Yisrael kamisha asar be'av ukiyayim akipurim a Gemara in Tainis. There are no Yom Tovim like the 50th of Av and Yom Kippur. Why? Shebehem b'nais Yisrael yotzes b'kli lavan. The young girls would go out in white clothing. Shulan they borrow shalavayishes mishein lai. They didn't want anyone to be embarrassed, so everyone borrowed clothing so everyone had, and therefore they made shadachim. So says the Gemara Bishlam Yom Kippurim Yom Slicho Mechila. Excuse me, we don't know the shadachim part. That's what we're learning right now. So Bishlam Yom Kippurim Yom Slicho Mechila. Yom Kippur was the day that we get kapara. Yom Shnas Luchas Achraynos. You got the second luchas. But I asked the Gemara L'Chamish Ba'av Maihi. What is the simcha of Chamisha Asar Ba'av? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. 10 lines to the bottom explains Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Yom Shehotru Shvatim Lavai Zeh Bezeh. Chamisha Asar Ba'av was the day that the Shvatim were allowed to marry into one another. My Dirosh. Where do we know that this is allowed? Zeh Davar. Davar Zeh Lo Yehei Noyeg Elo B'dar Zeh. That this halacha that you only can marry, that you're not allowed to marry out of your shevet, it was only for that dar, the dar that was went into Eretz Yisrael, but not for all daires. Continues the Gemara, once we're on the discussion of that which happened on Chamisha Asar Ba'av, Rav Chana Amar Rav Yechanan. Yoim She'utar Sheva Binyamin Lavei Bekal. Was the day that Sheva Binyamin was allowed to marry into Klal Yisrael to Chsev, as the Pasuk teaches, 5 lines to the bottom, Ish Yisrael Nishbar B'mitzvah. That the Ish Yisrael made a shvua in mitzvah lemar saying, Ish mimenu lo yitin bita leBinyamin, that no one should give over their daughter to Binyamin Lish as a wife. My drush. So what was the pasuk that we learned out that later on this was allowed? Mimenu veloi mibanenu. That we learned out mimenu, but not from among our daughters, and therefore al chamishas ba'av it became mutter for Sheva Binyamin to marry into Klal Yisrael. Rav Dimi Bar Yosef Rav Nachman, a third thing that happened on Chamishas B'av. Yom Shekalaba Masei Midbar was the day that those that were dying in the Midbar stopped dying. Damar Mar Ad Shlokalu Meisei Midbar, until those in the desert stopped dying. Lo Yadibar in Maisha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not speak with Moshe Rabbeinu as a Magefa. As Klal Yisrael was sitting there dying, Moshe Rabbeinu did not have any direct communication with Hashem. Shenemar, as the pasuk says in the top line of Kuf Chafal V'Meis Vika Sher Tamu Kol Anshe Amalchama Islamos, that it was when all the people from the war stopped dying. Mikar Bamam. To me was the Dibar, which was not previously, and this was after the Meisei Midbar stopped, which was on Chamisha Asar Ba'av. Ula Amar, a fourth reason for the Simcha on Chamisha Asar Ba'av, Yom Shabita Ba'Yishaya Ben Ela Pardeisais Sha'ishev Yiravim Ben Al Derachim, was the day that Yishaya Ben Ela was mevatel, destroyed the idols that Yeravim Ben Vat stationed on the road up to Yerushalayim. Shlal Yisrael Regel, causing Klal Yisrael not to go Oile Regel. Rav Nasna Amar, a fifth reason, Yom Shenasnu Arugei Beitar Likfura, was the day that the Arugei Beitar were finally allowed to be buried. Amar Rav Nasna, as Rav Nasna taught on the first wide line, Kof Chaval Amar Aleph teaches, Rav Nasna Oisayim, on that day, Shenasnu Arugei Beitar Likfura, Tiknu B'Yavne, and Yavne, they were metake in the bracha of Hatoiv v'Hametiv. Hatoiv God shleisrichu, the bodies are not decay, v'Hametiv, and we would call this very good that what Shenasu Likvura, that they were allowed to be buried. Rabba Rav Yosef Darmer Tabayu. Moving on to the third wide line, the sixth reason of a Simchan, the Chamishas Rav. It was the day in which they stopped cutting down the wood for the Maracha, for the Beis Hamikdash, for the Mizbeach. Tanya, as was learned in the Brayse of Lazar Gadol Kimin Sheigiach Chamishas Rav Tisha Shekaychel Shalchama. The sun's rays weakened, V'leya Karsin eats in the Maracha. And therefore they were not cut wood for the Maracha anymore because it was not dried out sufficiently. They call that day the day of the axes breaking. From that day on, one who adds on hours to his daily learning at night will add on days to his life. If you don't add on days, then what? Yosef, then it will not. Continues the Gemara. What does this word Yosef mean? My Yosef, Tani Rav Yosef, Tikbere Ime. What it means is, unfortunately, his mother will die. And we continue on the theme that we're discussing, the Zchus HaTorah, Tanu Rabbanan, Shiva, Kiplu, as Kol Ha'ilam Kulai. There were 7 righteous people that spanned the entire world. Misushelach Ra Adam. Misushelach Sa'adai Marishain Shem Ra. Misushelach Yaakov Ra Shem. Amra as Yaakov. Achia Shiloini Ra as Amram. Elio Ra as Achia Shiloini. Vadayin Kayim. Vachia Shiloini. Excuse me. Elio Ra as Achia Shiloini. Vadayin Kayim. And Elio Hanavi is still alive. So that shows us that these 7 Talmidei Chachamim spanned all of creation. Ask the Gemara of Achia Shiloini Ras Amram. V'aksev lo neisvem ish kiim kol ben Yefuna v'shu ben Nun. Amar Avinu lo nixigzer al Shvatei Shalevi. They were still around. There was no lo neisvem ish from the other Shvatim. D'chsev v'midra azeh yiplu b'greicha v'chol b'kudechem l'chol misparchem mi ben esrim shana v'amala. And from there we learn out to me Shabikuda ben Esim Yatza Shifta Shalevi Shabikuda mi ben Shloishim, and therefore from Ben Levi there were those that were left around. Says the Gemara Mishar Shvatim Layayil. There were no one else left from the other Shvatim. Vatani Yer ben Menashe Machar ben Menashe. Naldu b'mei Yaakov v'loy meisu Ashach Yisrael Laaretz, and they were not nifter till Klal Yisrael entered Eretz Yisrael. Shenemar v'yikum Anshe Hai Kishloishim v'Shisha Ish. Tanya Shloshim V'Shisha Mamish 36. They were Yehuda. Like 36. So he's talking about that Yair ben Menashe was still alive and he was like the Rav Sanhedrin. So what do we see? We see there were even some non-Leviim that were left around that survived the Midbar and went into Eretz Yisrael. Elam Rav Acher bar Yaakov l'nigzik zera al pachas b'men esrim. Not so less than 20 years old. You learn Xer from Erechon. Just like by Erechon, the value of 1 above 60 is like 1 under 20. So it is true they were around, but they were not included in that drasha. And the word is quote is to show we see the incredible value of Talmud Torah that it brings. We see that these 7 Talmidei Chacham spanned all of generations. Pick it up from Yibayel Hu B'Siyata Dishmaya.